Hi guys, it's Owen here from D20. This is Lucy, and the little one here, that's Morsel. It's a chilly day in Cape Town, so I've got a pile of dogs on my lap. That's just going to happen. Today I'm going to be talking about, not shorts for a change, I'm going to be talking about Magic the Gathering again. As you guys are aware, my area of interest when it comes to Magic is casual play, when it comes to sort of beginner intermediate level of play. And my favorite format, as I've mentioned before, is Commander. It used to be called EDH, Elder Dragon Highlander. It's not called that anymore, it's now called Commander, even though people still like to call it EDH sometimes. I don't know why we have this fascination with three-letter acronyms. It's weird. It's called Commander. That's what it's called. Okay, so Commander. Now, although Commander is... let me just bring you up to speed on what Commander is in case you're not aware. So Commander is a format where you've got 100 cards in a deck. One of those cards is a legendary creature. This is one of my commanders. That's Alicia, who smiles at death. And you have to build your deck according to the color coordination that's on the commander card. It's 100 cards, as I mentioned, singleton, so you're only allowed one copy of each card in the entire deck, except obviously for basic lands. And then it's a multiplayer format, so it's 3 to 5 players in a pod typically. I mean, you can go more than that, but 6-player commander is a trap. Don't do it. Don't do it. You'll be there all night. And also, your commander card isn't shuffled into your library like a normal creature would be. They exist in a separate area on the battlefield, on the board, called the command zone. They can be summoned from the command zone as if they were in your hand at any time. When they die, or when they move between zones on the battlefield or in the game, you can opt to send them back to the command zone, where you can summon the commander from the command zone again. But each time the commander returns to the command zone, to get them out again, it costs an extra 2 colorless mana. So that's the mechanic around Commander. Multiplayer format, singleton, based around the Commander card typically, and uses their color ID. Now, although Commander is a casual format, which it is, it's difficult to compete in a multiplayer game. And when you've got singleton, you've got all kinds of crazy stuff that's going on. Competitive Commander, although it kind of sort of exists, the format doesn't really lend itself to a competitive play environment, so it's almost by default a casual way of playing. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't still get pretty hectic and intense. And some Commander decks can tend to get some pretty complicated stuff going on. Now, the card pool of legal cards for Commander is huge. It's pretty much the same as Legacy. There are a couple of exclusions, but generally speaking, it's pretty much any card that's ever been printed can be played in a Commander deck. So when you've got 100 different cards, singleton, with any card available, you can imagine that the interactions can get out of hand. And it's interesting because it's such a thick deck, and because it's multiplayer, odds are you're not going to see every card in your deck every game. You get all kinds of cool stuff going on. But what happens is that some players who are not playing at a high level, who are perhaps at the beginner intermediate level, will dig themselves into a trap, and they will play commander decks that are too complicated for them. So that's what we're talking about today, is 7 signs that your commander deck might be too complicated for you. So, sign number 1. You have been playing Magic for less than 6 months. So although Commander is a casual format, it's not really a beginner-friendly format. If you're new to the game and you don't have that many games of normal Magic under your belt, Commander might be a little bit out of your depth. Now, I'm not going to tell you that you shouldn't try to play Commander. Absolutely, the more people we get in the format, the better. But if you're new to the game, I would recommend holding off a little while until you're confident that you have a good grasp of the fundamentals of the game. And once you're ready, then you can dive in. New players. Well, it's fun to encourage new players into the casual formats, but I'd recommend that Commander generally is a little bit too complex for new players. Number 2, you never summon your Commander. So as I said, your Commander sits outside the battlefield and you can bring them in at any time. The Commander is very important because you built your deck around the color ID of the Commander. But if you never actually summon your Commander, so you play game after game and your Commander just sits in the command zone and does nothing all the time, that's an indication that maybe you haven't really understood the mechanic around which your deck is built. Because typically, I realize there are exceptions, obviously. Sometimes people will add a Commander to a deck simply for the color ID and they have no intention of ever casting it. That's the exception, and I think that people who do that, perhaps it's just because they haven't really thought through the potential value of having a commander available, a card that can be summoned at any time from the command zone that can potentially bolster the strategy of the rest of the deck. I think that that's again, there are always exceptions. It's not a hard and fast rule, but typically I think it's a short-sighted deck building strategy to have an entire card slot in your deck that's wasted if you're not using it. If you're not summoning your commander, typically it means that either you don't know how your commander really works, how it interacts with the rest of your deck, or you don't see the value of having that commander. In which case, I'd suggest that deck is maybe too complicated for you. You might want to think about changing up your commander, make it something a little bit simpler, a little bit less complicated, something that you can understand and grasp. Alright, number 3. Your opponents react with excitement when you play a card and you can't see why. I mean, this might have happened to you. The thing about Commander is that it's a very social game. It's not just about what's happening on the table. It's about what's happening between the different players. So you should at least be constantly monitoring the facial reactions of the players around you whenever you take an action. And if you put a card down and they go, and you don't know why, that might be telling you that there's an interaction in your deck that you're not aware of, which suggests that your deck might be more complex than you understand. Number 4. You've played the deck at least 5 times before, but you still need to read every single card. If you've played the deck once, odds are you haven't seen every card in the deck. If you've played it 2 or 3 times, you've probably seen all the cards. Once you get to about the 5th game or more, then you should be getting to the point where you recognize the cards that are most pivotal to the strategy, and everything else is either not really all that relevant or it's something familiar. In other words, you should be able to look at a card as soon as you draw it, glance at it, and have a rough idea of what it does. You shouldn't have to read every word of every card every game. If you're doing that, it means that there's a strategy going on in your deck that you haven't really fully internalized. Perhaps you should be looking at the cards, especially the ones that have a lot of text on them. You should set them aside for now. Put something in simpler to replace them temporarily until you're up to speed on what your deck is doing, and then you can look at swapping those more complex cards back in. Alright, number 5. You have to recount your mana base multiple times a turn. Now, I realize there are some cards in the game that make mana generation a little bit complicated. We're talking about things like Tron lands. If you've got a full set of Tron lands, you've got 3 lands generating 7 mana, that can be hard to keep track of sometimes. If you've got filter lands like Graven Cairns here, or if you've got these weird flippy artifact land things from the Ixalan block, they do interesting and complicated things, which is cool. That's the kind of fun stuff in Commander. But if you're losing track of how much mana you've got on the table, something tells me that your mana pool is perhaps a little bit more complicated than you need it to be. You might want to, again, take out those more complicated mana generation tools until you've got a handle on where the rest of your mana is coming from. Once you're confident with the rest of it, start bringing those things back in one by one. If you've got an Everflowing Chalice but you never use it because you can't remember how much mana it's generating each turn, that Everflowing Chalice needs to come out and rather swap it out for a basic land in the short term. You can bring that Everflowing Chalice back again in the future. Number 6. Your opponents have to remind you of your own triggers every single time. Now, not all decks have relevant cards that have passive triggers going off all the time, but if your deck does, if you have a thing that says every time you cast an enchantment or a sorcery and you're forgetting to activate these triggers every time they happen, and your opponents are having to remind you that you have these triggers, that tells me that your deck is maybe a little bit too complicated for you. Maybe you should take some of those cards out so you can manage a smaller number of those triggers that are going off. Once you've figured out how those work and once you've internalized the mechanism there, you can start bringing in those other triggered effects one by one until you've mastered the deck. And then number 7, which is the most obvious sign, but a lot of people miss it, is that your turns take too long. When it's your turn and your opponents pull out their phones, or they go for a smoke, or they just sigh loudly and repeatedly, that should be telling you that your deck is too complicated for you, because it means that you're taking too long to play out your turn. Now, I realize there are some decks that literally just take a long time to play out a turn. If you're playing something like a Storm or something like that, you really are casting a lot of spells in your turn and it's going to take a long time. Ideally, you shouldn't be doing that every turn. That's typically only your last turn or 2 at the end of the game. But if you're taking longer than 3 or 4 minutes for your turn, sure, there's something going on in your deck that you haven't fully understood, because it means all of those things. It means you're recounting your mana constantly. It means you're rereading all of your cards. It means that you're not clear on the interactions between your cards. You don't have it all up here. You're having to reabsorb it constantly, and that tells you that your deck is too complicated. So, I mean, I've played in games where guys literally will take 10 to 15 minutes for a single turn. And that's not deep in the game. We're not talking 15 turns down. We're talking like turn 3 is 10 minutes long. That's a problem. Guys, if your deck is requiring you that you need to take that long for your turn, you might want to rethink it. Not just because you're not understanding it, but because you're not being a good sportsman. You're interrupting the flow of the game for everybody else. You're forcing everybody else to wait for you. And when you're taking that long to take your turn, there isn't that much for them to do, because that means that you're not interacting with the other players actively. That means you're messing around with your own stuff, and you're not clear on what all is going on. So those are the 7 signs that your deck is too complicated for you. Now, how do you solve that? Now, well, the one way of solving it is as I suggested. If you're finding something that's a little bit complex, especially cards that have a lot of text on them, take them out. Replace them with something simpler that has the same color profile or does a similar thing. Once you're comfortable with that, you can swap it back out again. It's not going to be that much of a detriment to your performance. Rather have a simpler deck that isn't as strong, that you understand, than a complex deck that you're not clear on what you're doing. If you're just starting out, you're just joining in the Commander format, I'd recommend going for the pre-constructed decks. Those decks are pretty solid performance-wise. They do okay. And they're designed specifically for players to pull them out of the box and play them immediately. They tend not to have overly complicated mechanics. Obviously they vary from one to the next, but generally speaking it's stuff that's pretty self-evident. You don't need to be keeping track of everything as it goes along. And then once you've got that solid pre-con deck ready to go, then you can start upgrading it. Once you're comfortable with how it all works, you can swap out the basic lands for more complicated mana sources. You can introduce more powerful versions of whatever's in the deck. There's a lot of work you can be doing with that, and once you're comfortable with that level of play, you can start building your own decks. But as your first commander deck, although my first commander deck was a deck that I'd built from scratch, I'd been playing casual Magic for a couple of years at that point, so I already had a pretty good grasp of the game. If you're new to the game, especially like I said in number 1, if you've been playing the Magic for 6 months or less, building your own commander deck is probably not wise. You want to buy one of those pre-con decks. It's only a few $100. It sounds like a lot, but you're getting some good value. There's some really good cards in there, and it's so much fun. Pick up one of those pre-con decks, start with that, and then fix it up as you go along. Listen to the advice of other players, because they'll be giving you tips on what you can use. Or if somebody else is playing a similar deck to yours, observe to see what they're doing, what cards that they've added to their deck that you might want to copy in the future. But you don't want to get yourself out of your depth, because then you're ruining your own experience, and you're ruining the experience for everybody else around the table. You want to keep your deck at a level that's simple enough for you to manage, and also for your opponents. If you're dazzling all of your opponents and they don't know what you're doing, you might want to throttle back on that a little bit as well, because then they're not having fun. Alright, that's all I've got to say about that. If you've got some thoughts, you think that I've gone too far or I haven't gone far enough, I'm going to put on my troll helmet. There it is. So the narcissistic trolls in my comment section, feel free, come at me, bro. If you've got anything to say, comment section down below on YouTube, or it's on the side. Is it this side? Maybe it's this side. I can't remember. In Facebook, one of those two. You can find me on Discord, Twitter, Vivo, Minds, all kinds of places. Those links are all below. And we can have a chat about it. We can talk about Commander, and hopefully if you're in the area we can play a few games. That'll be a lot of fun. Alright, that's it for now. SWAT out.